With World Press Freedom Day on May 3 just on the horizon, a global celebration that's coming home to the Namibian capital 30 years after the adoption of the Windhoek Declaration, who better to talk to than journalists themselves about their hopes and expectations for media on this important anniversary? This is the second in the Namibia Media Trust's Free Speak three-part series of podcasts on World Press Freedom Day. I'm your host, Gwen Lister, and with me today are Kelvin Chiringa, who is the radio presenter and journalist at Eagle FM, and he hosts a breakfast show titled The Early Morning Scoop, and Sakeus Iikela, who is a journalist at the Namibian and also the Secretary General of the Namibia Media Professionals Union, Nampu. Welcome to you both.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Gwen, for the invitation. We do appreciate it.
Good to have you here to chat about this important subject. First up, if we could talk a little bit about the Windhoek Declaration of 1991 and what it means to journalists. It's always been said it was mainly print-focused, which of course it was, because at that time there was mainly print in the media world, but much of its content applies as succinctly today as it did 3 decades ago. Can I ask you both, what stands out to you as young journalists inheriting this declaration? What stands out to you as key concepts in the declaration itself?
Maybe for me to begin with, the declaration, it sinks its teeth in the concept of media pluralism, that we need to have as many media organizations as possible. Having had experience with countries where you do have, a restriction as far as, getting into that space is concerned, especially when it comes to, radio. I've had pretty much a whole lot of my educational background really being sunk in Zimbabwe, where to get a license as a radio operator that's liberal is something that's nearly impossible, because the state has a way of trying to and has always wanted to control the airwaves.
Right.
So when you're talking about media pluralism, that's a very important concept for me. And also the fact that in 1991 still the crafters of this declaration had the foresight to see that it's important that we have unions that represent journalists. Very important that we are also in the presence of Mr. Iikela there, who's also been quite instrumental in the founding of the union that we have now, of which he is the General Secretary. So those are the elements really that stand out. And also to the fact that when the document was crafted, the world was emerging from Cold War politics.
Right.
That was about the time that the Berlin Wall had fallen. And the greatest headache that a lot of countries had right across the world was, how do we democratize this space and allow for journalists to operate without fear, and victimization. You, Gwen, you come from that generation, where you had to literally walk through dead bodies and explosions, bombs, and all that. So that really stands out. The fact that you also stood for journalists by that time that were detained to say we need their immediate release. For me, that was a far cry right into the sense of time, right into the future, to speak to future generations, to say no government has the obligation to arrest a journalist for simply doing their job, because journalism is not a crime.
Right. Kelvin, perhaps I can quickly add before we hand over to Saki that one of the crafters of the Windhoek Declaration and later founder of MISA was indeed one of your compatriots, Vincent Chikwari, who headed up the Zimbabwe Union of Journalists, ZUJ, at the time. I believe he's late now, but certainly Zimbabwe was well represented.
That's right.
Saki, over to you. What's some thoughts about it?
Yeah, Gwen, just to add to what Kevin have said about the independence of media organizations, for me, I think it's important that the media entities in Namibia operate away from the control of the government, or either large corporations, commercial corporations that would like perhaps to influence the content and the editorial policies of these institutions. Just to add that the declaration also protects journalists from the restrictions, as Kevin has said, and it also puts the journalist, the duty on the journalist to make sure that the news that they produce is not going to harm first of all, to harm
Correct.
their subjects. Is not going to prejudice, or let's say I'm looking for a word, but
Maybe
yeah.
basically prejudice the public interest or something
prejudice
like
the
that.
public interest. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say. So it gives back the control or the power to journalists to make sure that whatever they write, whatever they broadcast, or whatever they film, whatever they produce on, for example, on social media, is in the best interest, and is in the best interest of the public, and it contributes to the development of society. Yeah.
Thanks for that, Saki. I think you've both raised some very important, lesser known issues about the Declaration. Most people, of course, know it as the Declaration which paved the way for a free, independent, and pluralistic media on the continent. And I think it did indeed usher in an era of wider acceptance of these principles.
Yes.
I mean, SADC and the African Union eventually came on board and accepted them. And that's not to say every African country, of course, does practice what they preach. But there were other aspects also of this declaration that are important too, and often go unnoticed. It did stress, and Kelvin's mentioned that, the importance of setting up truly independent and representative journalist unions. And that was 3 decades ago. So 30 years later, the Namibia Media Professionals Union, as I mentioned earlier, has got off the ground here in Namibia. And Saki, give us an idea of where you're currently at in regard to this union. Are you making progress?
Yeah, we could say that we are making slow progress.
Okay.
As you know, that the Namibia Media Professionals Union is the first of its kind to
Right.
represent of its kind to represent journalists in Namibia. We just launched in November last year, and we are quite still in an infancy, preparing, of course, setting out several structures that we need to create,
Sure.
and to kind of applying to the labor commissioner, because as a union, as a labor union, you need to be
Registered?
recognized
Okay.
by the labor commissioner, so
Okay.
that you operate within the legal framework of the
Sure.
of the country.
Okay.
So we are still at the point of registering with the labor commissioner.
Okay.
We have filed our constitution already last year, somewhere between June and July. But due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we are not. Apparently, the Labour Commissioner was not able to process applications.
Okay.
So we are still waiting for that, of course, recognition. But in terms of getting membership or getting recognition from various media entities, that we are still in the process of doing that.
Okay.
And that is where we are now, and that process is still, as I said, a slow progress. Yeah.
But at least progress is being made, and it's getting off the ground.
I can say that progress has been made in terms of the fact that we have launched. That means a lot to the
Absolutely.
journalism industry in Namibia already. And the fact that we have started recruiting members from at various institutions, that can also be recognized or regarded as progress in that direction.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thanks for that, Saki. Maybe, Kelvin, to turn to you as a broadcaster, another lesser-known fact about the Windhoek Declaration is that it also really paved the way for the African Charter on Broadcasting 10 years after the adoption of the Windhoek Declaration. The declaration itself had emphasized at the time, since it mainly involved print media, the importance of radio and television, actually also convening a similar seminar in order to ensure independence and pluralism in this sector too. And we all know the history in Africa of the airwaves, which have always been traditionally tightly under the control of governments. But slowly after the African Charter, radio, much like print, began to open up the continent's airwaves, and that was after decades of government control. Radio generally, and this is the question I really want to ask you, Kelvin, has it risen to the challenge? Do you think it's a solid provider of news and information to the public, given the power of this medium on the continent?
Very powerful indeed. Radio is considered to be the oldest social media.
Yeah.
Before the term social
Absolutely.
media was crafted, and before we had these integrated digital communication systems, radio was there. Just to give a little bit of history, in 1896, a German physicist by the name Heinrich Hertz discovered radio waves.
Good
It had
Lord.
to take an Italian to then come up with the first model of a radio. That was in 1896, 1895. By 1900, we had the first commercial radio. About the time, 4 years later, we had the First World War, 1904 until from 1940 to 1918. So some few years later, we had the First World War. And the power of radio was used around the time when countries were fighting, at the in different fronts. And after the First World War, we saw Nazism in Germany, where radio was also very, very important. We saw Nazism, fascism in Italy as well. But right about the time through, if you take a look at the phase through the Cold War politics, the Cold War period,
Right.
that was about the time that the winds of change were now blowing through Africa, and the need to propagandize the masses in terms of them understanding what the struggle was all about. Radio came up to that task to say, this is the medium to make use of, because you're speaking to a population that is in the rural areas. You're trying to create that revolutionary vanguard, which comes from the rural areas, that people who don't have access to the newspapers, which are in the cities and towns. And about that time also, you could see that because of the power of radio, the powers that be could not allow the
Independent.
exactly
broadcasters.
they couldn't allow that. And then you have what I would rather call exile radio, where the nationalists will then go outside the country, from where they are training, and then they have got their own radios there. If you take a look at the narrative around the Cuban Revolution, Che Guevara, Fidel Castro founding their Rebelde radio rebellion, in the jungles. In Zimbabwe, they had Radio Maputo. In Mozambique, where they were broadcasting from.
Exactly. And you had one in the UK as
Exactly,
I recall.
you see.
Yes.
And then, quite interestingly, you look at the new independence dispensation in Zimbabwe, you do have certain people, certain journalists that cannot operate in that particular country, that go to America and make use of Voice of America, that go to the UK and make use of other, these exile radios, and they are speaking still to the masses. So radio it's there to stay. It is the oldest social media, but radio along the way it had not yet realized its fullest potential, because radio was predominantly a platform of entertainment.
Correct.
It wasn't fully exploited by the journalist as a platform on which
Good point.
we can then manifest the true form of investigative journalism, truly opening the minds of the people. And this space, again, is restricted by the powers that be, the weaponization of the airwaves.
Exactly.
Countries that have, given licenses so that they can amplify their voices at the expense of other people. But Namibia, being again the mother of the Windhoek Declaration and being the cradle, as I would want to say, of freedom of expression, by the virtue of Windhoek Declaration, today sees itself as on a pedestal, as a knight in shining armor, as far as free press is concerned.
Right.
And it's not ironic that we have the world converging once again here in Namibia in a few days' time, as we will be taking a look at celebrating the Windhoek Declaration. So we're beginning to see the fullest potential of radio now, that we now having commercial talk radio. Because if you're talking about talk radio, it was understood to be, it's supposed to be a community radio where you talk about your community issues. We're talking about national issues.
Correct.
We are investigating. We are opening files and documents.
Yeah.
We are pinning people to the wall and, asking for accountability, making use of this. And that's why you have Eagle FM coming. And then the fact that Eagle FM is there, and the fact that we have already trailblazed, it's an indication that other forces are also seeing the fullest potential of radio.
And will follow suit.
It's likely to follow suit, and that's how we democratize, and that's how we build our democracy. So I believe that we are coming, other radios are still coming, but we are there. We have reached the point where we have realized, this is what radio can fully do.
Exactly.
It's just a matter of other radio stations
such
also
an
coming.
amazing amount of potential.
Indeed.
I mean, that probably hasn't been fully realized.
Exactly.
And certainly not equitably in all the countries of our continent.
Right.
But certainly it's a great start.
Exactly. We are there.
And keeping the audience is very important.
Very
right?
much so, because
especially
you see-
because you're also
Yeah.
competing against social media as
Exactly.
are print.
Exactly. And the fact that information has become the new gold, that's the new oil. Information is the currency. People want to know what's happening. So as the story is breaking, as we are breaking the news, puts it on air, people are listening, you're reaching out to
Right.
people who are deep in the jungles,
Right.
deep in the forest, deep in the villages,
right.
wherever they are able to listen to this, and they're able to be at par with the national dialogue, and they are able to also be, to shape the national agenda, because radio is two-way. It's a little bit
Exactly.
different from newspapers, where you have to wait
Absolutely.
for that letter from the readers and all that. It's two-way. We are there to agree to disagree and to see both sides at the same time. Yeah.
Exactly. But of course, it's as constrained in many ways as print media, because of course radio can be used and abused, and we know from the famous Rwanda example and the Tutu and Hutsi and so on, Hutu and Tutsi. Sorry.
Yeah, no. Kelvin spoke about the history of radio, but I think he didn't touch about he didn't talk about the history of radio in Namibia, because I think, Gwen, you might as well agree that radio in Namibia was also used during the liberation struggle. There was I think it's a one is it that radio that was broadcasting from Lusaka.
Voice of Namibia.
Yeah, Voice
Yes.
of Namibia. Yeah,
Right.
During that time, Voice of Namibia was used to bring the messages of the ruling party, not currently the current ruling party. By
Right,
that
the
time
liberation
was
movement then.
Yeah, liberation movement SWAPO. To Namibia by that time, so there was no other radio station that was talking about that, about the voice and the message of the liberation struggle by that time. So I think after independence, then we got this new radio station that came up. Apart from the NBC, we have had commercial radio stations that only, as Gwen has said, that has not really reached up to their potential. They basically transformed into music radio stations.
Right, and I
they
think
don't-
part
yeah,
of the reason
yeah.
why radio had not yet reached its fullest potential was because the people that were behind the mics, they were not journalists,
That's
and they have not
correct.
been. They are
That's correct.
presenters.
Yeah.
These are people who are into the superficial elements of society. They want to look at the things on top. They don't really want to dig deeper.
Dig deep, yeah.
They are not your hardcore blast furnace journalists.
Exactly.
And as we get more and more of journalists populating that space,
Right.
definitely the revolutionization of radio begins to take
Begins
effect.
to
Definitely. And
it's
with-
definitely, and don't forget, ownership plays a very important role as well.
Right.
There are certain owners of radio station who don't want to be controversial or
Right.
to go into those difficult areas of politics, and they just want to entertain and,
Right.
as Kelvin said, stick to that mandate.
And with the birth of Eagle FM, I think other radio stations are also starting now to wake
Right.
up to the task and
To compete also,
compete
Big
with,
time.
seeing that.
with
Exactly.
Eagle
Yeah.
FM. And we have seen some newspapers also starting to kind of create digital content through podcast and through video,
Absolutely.
video and
Online.
and
Exactly.
online content.
Right.
Yeah.
Good. If we look at, as we've all affirmed several times, the United Nations General Assembly declared May 3 World Press Freedom Day as a result of the Windhoek Declaration. And of course, it's all happening here in our capital just in a few weeks' time. But I'd love to hear from the both of you. What are your personal expectations of the conference? What would you like to see on the agenda? And what do you see, and whether you see this as a meaningful event for young journalists? And maybe I can start with Saki, just to ask you, Saki, what, if any, input has your union had on this sort of shaping of this conference, on the process that's unfolding? And perhaps a related question, as a union, even though you're in the early stages, have you reached out beyond the borders to other unions? Just give us an idea.
To start with the preparation of the conference, unfortunately, the union has not been approached to partner or either to be a member of the committees that are preparing the conference or the celebration of the World Press Freedom Day. We are still waiting. Maybe those who are in charge of this event will still probably reach out to us.
Right. I hope so.
But we have not been approached for anything like that. In terms of our let's say collaboration with like-minded unions, as we have after we launched in November last year, we reached out to the International Federation of Journalists.
Okay, good.
To be a member, and then we successfully registered with them. Just this morning, I had a meeting with them and talking about WordPress Freedom Day
excellent.
celebration, and how the working condition of journalists in Namibia, and various issues that touches press freedom.
Okay. Yes, because I think
yeah.
they involved in a panel or two,
A panel or
some
two,
of the
yes,
sessions.
yes. Yeah. So basically, that's what we as Namibia Media Professionals Union stand at in terms of the celebration of the WordPress Freedom Day. Just to mention, the union currently, although we are not involved in the official commemoration of the event, we have taken it up on ourselves to organize a sideline event with other institutions that have similar interest with us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, for example, the Internet Society of Namibia and the Namibia Science and Technology University, NAST. So we are going to have kind of a parallel commemoration, but ours will be based mainly on online platforms, where we are going to interview journalists, where we are going to have plays, where we are going to have students of journalism who would perhaps who would give us their views on the commemoration of the event, and have various events that would, of course, contribute to the commemoration of the event.
Great, good to hear that. And Kelvin, what do you, from your perspective, what do you hope to see from this conference, and what can young journalists expect to get from this, put it that way?
The fact that the world is going to be here.
Right.
I'm looking forward
some of it's a hybrid conference, of course, but so not all the boots will be on the ground.
Of course,
but still,
The brushing of shoulders between journalists
Absolutely.
here in Africa and elsewhere should be able to see us in a position creating synergy corporations. There was a point when we tried to reach out to some media institutions in Kenya and Uganda, seeking to, have a collaborative effort towards the coverage of the Ugandan elections. The recent ones. And we couldn't really establish that because of distance, and probably because we're also trying to sniff at each other to say, who are you and why do you want to do this?
Yes.
So the fact that we are coming in this space together, I'm looking forward to creating those synergies between media houses from one continent to the next, from one country to the next. I'm also looking forward to, and those synergies also should also center around investigative units. Right, if we can come together and collaborate from there, and also to robustly and decisively talk about the issue of the Access to Information Bill, which we are struggling with here in the country. We want that bill to be passed into law.
Right.
We want to robustly engage government in this particular event, so that out of this particular event, we should be able to know when exactly are we going to be having this bill put into law. And at the same time, we need to discuss about the issue of fake news. Maybe I'll come to it later on when it comes to what we expect what we expect in terms of the outcome. Right?
Exactly.
I'm sure we're coming to that in terms of what was in the declaration that we didn't see coming out. But this is exactly what we are looking forward to: the synergies, the robust conversations, and also to tap into how best can we counter fake news.
Exactly.
By the time that you guys,
very important question.
By the time you guys came up with the declaration in 1991, I don't think fake news was a phenomenon.
We had lots of propaganda, though. Which
There was
is
a lot
more
of
or
propaganda,
less the same thing,
right? Or more or less the same thing.
Yeah.
But fake news today is something else. And how do we define fake news, and who defines it? Because from a political perspective, we have seen the former American president, defining fake news as something else. If you are putting information that is against me, that's fake news. No matter how relevant, no matter the sources you've quoted, that is fake news because you are against us.
Exactly. Saki, before I turn to you, can I quickly just interrupt to say that just Kelvin's point about synergies is very important with journalists, because, the popular union slogan, an injury to one is an injury to all.
Right.
We all face the same and common problems. Namibia might be more free than other African nations, especially in terms of safety as journalists, but democracy is always fragile and things can change.
Right.
So the better collaboration we have across border, the better for us all. Saki, maybe if you can just, with what you're going to say now, just let me mention that, as Kelvin's also suggested, every World Press Freedom Day conference comes up with a declaration. That's standard practice, and it reflects the outcome of the discussions held during the conference. And it's expected that, and this is the point I think you wanted to address, that the 2021 declaration will take into account the changed and changing media environment in the world, not only in Africa, particularly vis-a-vis digital media, which is a more recent innovation. And of course, maybe you can speak to that, what you'd like to see in that declaration, especially on, I think, the subject you wanted to address now, the issue of fake news.
Yes. Yeah, just to add on what Kevin has said already about fake news. When you, of course, you were part of the declaration in 19 when you came up with the Windhoek Declaration. So when you came up with this declaration, there was no social media really at that point.
Absolutely, not
Yeah,
even
and fake news. If you talk about fake news currently in today's society, you are not going to talk about fake news and then you leave out social media, because we have not really seen, for example, in Namibia, or let's say in Africa, we have not really seen fake news being perpetrated in traditional media. Let's say newspapers,
as much.
Okay,
Right.
of course, there has been a degree of fake news, but not as much as it's been perpetrated on social media. So,
Absolutely.
for this year's commemoration, we would like to see the resolutions on how journalists can deal with fake news. Let's say on social media, how not only journalists but consumers of news and fact checkers and the general public, how they will deal with fake news on social media. But what I wanted to the point I wanted to drive at is that we would like to see how journalists and how media entities are going to deal with the protection of journalists and the protection of news on social media.
Yeah.
And we have seen, of course, in several instances of journalists being harassed on social media by not only politicians, but by
ordinary folk.
Ordinary members of the public who would just go on social media and then discredit certain aspect of your news, or let's say certain aspect of a piece that you have written, just for the sake of it.
Exactly.
And they will start, of course, discrediting and insult and all these other things. So we would want to see greater protection of journalists on social media, and how media entities, of course, will transform and they would of course, let's say, the word escape from me. Yeah,
Yeah.
but in
Maybe while you are processing there.
Yeah, let me just process. Yeah.
If you take a look at the manner in which fake news has also been circulating, and possibly what I would call the disrespect of a journalist's work, the manner in which social media has a way of packaging content. It can be packaged with the corporate colors and insignias of the Namibian or Eagle FM or Informante, for instance.
Yeah, we've seen that a lot,
and you just have a clip taken, and then it's circulating on WhatsApp.
Yeah.
Right? I think we saw it with Informante recently when we're sharing it in our group where
we have seen that a lot.
When the defense minister resigned.
Yes.
Informante, I think somebody wrote Abasha resigns. Well, if you go to Informante's page, it says Vilo, defense minister, resigns.
Right.
So that is already circulating.
Yeah.
You see, that's circulating. It has got the corporate colors and insignias of Informante, and people far there will think this is coming from Informante. And that is part of the disrespect, and also, the disrespect on the work of journalists.
And
so
also the issue of media literacy is so critical that people just don't have the powers of discernment or sophistication to know truth from lies. And
that's right.
This is a problem I think that journalists too are facing, that we need to help educate the public on what are reliable sources of information and which are not.
Exactly. But then, you see, we are also dealing with the monopolistic power of the owners of the social media platforms.
Absolutely.
Talking about Twitter, talking about Facebook. There is certain content that you cannot put on these platforms, YouTube. And if that content is contra, intra, or against what they perceive to be, what they perceive to be orthodox, they can just kick you out, or they can just block you if you just say certain things out of probably, out of the courtesy of practicing your freedom of speech. You get to be blocked. How do we deal with that? Because these are the new dynamics that are coming in play also, especially where we are rigorously debating national issues, and we are probably trying to counter conspiracy theories, or we are trying to, put across certain ideologies and certain, pieces of information that might not really be considered to be, something orthodox. And another side might see it as a conspiracy, and then you get to be blocked from those platforms. How do we deal with that?
Absolutely.
As journalists right across the world?
Wow, they're big questions that we'll be facing there. Saki, do you want to finish your thought, and then we'll go on to the final question, because I think I'm getting signals we're running out of time, unfortunately.
Yeah, no. I just wanted to add to Kelvin, what Kelvin was saying about how the owners of these social media platform controls basically what we put out and how we put it out. For example, I remember that for example, in the case of the Namibian, during the time of the celebration of Olufuko, I think one of those events.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. Basically, Facebook just blocked some of the content that we put there because apparently it depicts pornography.
Right.
But in our context,
Right.
it's not pornography because that's a part of a culture or a tradition of a
Or like
certain
a depiction of the himba, which I think has also been removed from social media.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which is a tradition that has been practiced, let's say in Namibia, but it's blocked by Facebook just because apparently it depicts pornography. So how do we now go on and say and deal with let's say that kind of
or say the monopolistic power.
monopolistic power. Yes, yeah.
That's
Well,
true.
they're monopolizing the space.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. And it's one of the things I've often thought, why is it on earth that we are so dependent on these Western-dominated social media giants? Why have we not come up with African alternatives?
Right.
But I'm not going to get sidetracked, but I mean, why are we not doing something about this? Instead of, we complain, but we don't generate or innovate ourselves in this regard.
I think we are getting there in terms of, innovation in Africa. We have seen.
hope so.
We have seen. It's just maybe the how we receive some of the new inventions that our own people are coming up with. So we have seen, of course, some of the our. Some of African
Innovations.
innovations.
I've seen a WhatsApp platform
yeah.
created by an African.
Okay, good. Well, I'm
but it
glad
was
to
not
hear
received with the same hype as WhatsApp that comes from America, or let's say in any social media that comes from.
The Chinese have innovated around Facebook. They do have their own.
That's right.
WeChat.
The Facebook
The
is
WeChat,
blocked
yeah.
them.
Yeah.
Weibo or something.
Right, Weibo, yeah.
Guys, as we sort of head towards the end of this podcast, as I say, we can talk for hours. I know there's the fascinating threads that some of you have mentioned that I'd love to take off, but time doesn't permit. I just want to turn to the both of you and ask you, what do you see as some of the major challenges or obstacles that you face as young journalists operating in what is largely a peaceful environment in a country which still, to this point, enjoys #1 status in the African Press Freedom Rankings of Reporters Sans Frontières? And I'm going to add just one or two questions and you summarize towards the end. What is needed to continually elevate the standards of journalism? Because I think sometimes we tend to get bogged down into solving other people's problems. Just the question of fake news. Is it up to journalists to have to deal with that whole morass of mess, actually, that's often going on online? How do we recapture the public attention or appetite for good journalism without resorting to clickbait ourselves? Because I've seen traditional media now saying, okay, if that's what it takes to get someone to read my newspaper or look at my online platform, I'm going to do the type of stories that people want to consume, which is often infotainment. And finally, is it important to give people what they want rather than what they need? Your last comment, Saki, and then Kelvin.
Those are quite a number of questions, Gwen.
is.
But let me start with the working conditions of journalists in Namibia. Let's
please
say,
do.
in as much as we enjoy a free environment that we operate in, there are still certain issues that are, let's say, overlooked in some instances. For example, just last year we had an instance where a politician, for example, or a government official would just go to a certain media house,
Right.
or to a certain journalist and then tell them on how to write their story.
Oh, no.
Those are instances that we don't want to see in Namibia.
No, of course not.
Yeah, so apart from that, we have seen also instances where some journalists will complain to us in certain groups, in certain WhatsApp groups, on how, let's say, their bosses are treating them and how they are overworked and let's say under remunerated and all these other things.
Sure,
so
sure.
some of
The
these
usual.
these are some of the things that we need perhaps to look at as Namibian journalists to kind of improve the working conditions. In terms of just recap some of the questions, I think, because
Well, there was
Yeah.
also the
Yeah.
question of elevating standards of professionalism,
standards of profession, yeah.
trying to recapture the public attention.
As we have mentioned earlier about fake news, I think currently journalists need to do a little bit more. Not only journalists, but media houses as well, in terms of remaining relevant, because social media is a fast-moving environment. News come in and then people comment.
Right.
They don't know what is real news at some point, and they don't know what is fake news. So
Exactly.
we will need to come up with certain way of presenting, let's say, presenting or putting out what we regard as credible and reliable news, and that can be recognized and identified by our consumers as such. So
Exactly.
I think maybe all news organizations need to have a sort of presence on social media that their consumer or their audiences can resonate with, and then they can go on and relate and rely on for news.
And as you say, redevelop that trust and kind of go to tried and tested sources of information.
Definitely.
Rather than nonsense
rather than
sites.
just
Exactly.
independent
Good
journalists.
point. So we're
community
hoping
journalists
there'll
who
be
are-
something on the declaration to deal with that. Kelvin, few thoughts from you to
Do
conclude?
we give people what they want or what they need?
Yep.
How do we know what people want and what
Right.
people need if we don't ask them? There is
Right.
a need by media houses to, there's a need for media houses to conduct research.
Exactly.
What is it that the people really look up to every morning when they buy the paper or every morning they turn on the radio? What are the topics? Because we have preconceived notions and we have prescribed for people in our pursuit to shape the national narrative
Agenda, yeah.
and agenda. We have prescribed for people what they want. No, we feel like, over the years, we have made it a norm that sensationalism is what sells, is what they want. Anything to do with corruption, anything to do with something that's bizarre is exactly what the people want, because that's what we think. But possibly people want more than that.
And what we regard as serious news is at some point overlooked,
Right.
just because of
Absolutely.
some scandals that
Tabloid
are happening
journalism.
somewhere else. Yeah.
Yes,
Exactly.
exactly.
And what didn't stand out in the declaration, which we want to stand out this time around, is the issue of the minimum wage for journalists. We do have a problem where freelance journalists gets to be impoverished because there is no minimum wage for them. It's something that we have to talk about over a glass of beer.
Yeah, not
Yeah.
only minimum wage,
Right.
but contracts.
Contracts as well.
How do you do that, though, in a global context, Kelvin?
I think to talk about it,
Because, of course, the declaration
yeah,
is global.
to talk about it
Just to
and,
bring
and
it
to
in.
have synergies with the International Labour
Yeah,
Organization.
yeah,
From the
yeah.
perspective of journalists, this is what we're looking for, and if you can maybe champion that for us, if it's possible.
Absolutely. Good point.
If it's possible, right? So those are some of the issues, of course, that we need to look at. But also, how do we improve our journalism? Retraining, of course, we need to retrain. The experience that Gwen has from the 1980s, 1990s is different now because we are dealing with an entirely different creature in the
Right.
media on the media landscape. So we need to do retraining. We need to understand where the wind is blowing in terms of technology and innovation, and we need to go in that direction. For newspapers, you see that we had this dark prophecy in 2020 going backwards that newspapers are going to die because corporates are not coming up, budgets for advertisements are falling down. But then and companies are moving to online, and you're
Yes.
beginning to see the Namibian is actually taking its content online, having these audio clips, putting them online. The Namibian Sun is having this adverts being done online. They've got their own teams advertising on those spaces. So I think we need to retrain, we need to adapt, because if you do not adapt, you die.
But that also critically, which we haven't covered really, speaks to the issue of sustainability.
Right. Yeah.
And how, again, I think that's going to be an important discussion
Right.
to have. How we can help good journalism survive
That's right.
is going to be a critical discussion. Saki, last thought, and then we're going to have to close.
Yeah, I'm very much interested in the working conditions of journalists.
Sure.
As Kevin has said, that we would like a resolution taken to either the International Labour Organization, or maybe that will be taken by, of course, some of the international federations that we have for journalists.
Sure.
For example, the IFJ and many others that we have, to kind of elevate that call for media houses or media entities to kind of recognize that as much as we want good journalism from our employees, we would not get that. We will not get that if we
you don't pay
have
decent
not,
wages.
yeah,
If they're
decent
poor.
wages, yeah. If they are
Yeah.
poor, if they are crying,
Right.
we will not. That's why we get some of these claims that apparently journalists are being paid.
Checkbook
checkbook
journalism.
journalism.
Checkbook
well,
journalists, to write certain news or certain
Certainly.
to advance certain agendas of politicians or either corporations. So I would like to see a resolution on the protection and the improvement of the working conditions of journalists.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Good.
In terms of sustainability, I think we would need to innovate as media entities and monetize what we have, what we put out on social media, or let's say on online platforms. Just we must find a way of how to monetize such content and be able to create a revenue to survive.
I agree. I think the ball's in our court after all, and this World Press Freedom Day really provides us with the opportunity to introspect, to think about the things, to celebrate
Right.
the wonderful things that journalism has done in the world, and let's face it, it has, but also to look very critically at ourselves
Definitely,
as
yes.
we map a sustainable way forward and bring back the trust of the people.
Right.
Thank you both so much for joining us for this podcast, and I hope we can continue the discussion at some point in the future.
Thank you, Gwen, for the platform.
Thank you.
That's right, Gwen. We do appreciate it.
Thank you both.